there any nominations? Minister Iwaska.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair for the temporary. I'd like to nominate MLA Reyes.
Mr. Reyes has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, Mr. Reyes, please take the chair.
Thank you. Our next item of business is the election of a vice chairperson. Are there any nominations? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I nominate for the position of Vice Chair for this evening, Mr. MLA, Mr. Piniuk.
Mr. Piniuk has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing no other nominations, Mr. Piniuk is elected Vice Chairperson. This meeting has been called to consider the following bills. Bill 33, the Advanced Education Administration Amendment Act. Bill 34, the University College of the North Amendment Act. I would like to inform all in attendance of the provisions in our rules regarding the hour of adjournment. A standing committee meeting to consider a bill must not sit past midnight to hear public presentations or to consider clause by clause of a bill except by unanimous consent of the committee. We have a number of presenters registered to speak tonight. As noted on the list of presenters before you, we will therefore continue from where we left off at the meeting on Tuesday, April 13th. Those who were called but were not present in the previous meeting appear at the end of the list. A written submission has been received from Rob Schmidt, private citizen, on Bill 33 and has been distributed to all committee members. Does the committee agree to have this document appear in the Hansard transcript of this meeting? Agreed? Absolutely. Agreed, and so ordered. Prior to proceeding with public presentations, I would like to advise members of the public regarding the process for speaking in a committee. In accordance with our rules, a time limit of 10 minutes has been allotted for presentations, with another 5 minutes allowed for questions from committee members. If a presenter is not in attendance when their name is called, they will be dropped to the bottom of the list. If the presenter is not in attendance when their name is called a second time, they will be removed from the presenters list. The proceedings of our meetings are recorded in order to provide a verbatim transcript. Each time someone wishes to speak, whether it be an MLA or a presenter, I first have to say the person's name. This is a signal for the Hansard recorder to turn the mics on and off. Also, if any presenter has any written materials for distribution to the committee, please send the file by email to the moderator, who will distribute it all to the committee members. I will now call on Shauna Peloquin, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Peloquin, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the committee. My name is Shauna Peloquin. I am a member of the James Bay Cree Nation, and I am originally from unceded Anishinaabe land in northern Quebec. I am currently a student with the University of Winnipeg, and I have been in Winnipeg since 2017. Today here, I will talk to you about barriers. I will talk to you about fears, and I will talk to you about what this bill means for me and for a lot of students, and also what the behavior of this government has mean with the fear of student this year. So before I start, I'd like to invite everyone to take a deep breath, to acknowledge all the breaths that have been taken away this year. We are still surviving a global pandemic, and the reality of it is still waiting on all of us. Students, children, youth, adult, people in position of power, people in position of governance, and people who have the authority of passing the bill also. We also have healthcare. We're all in this together, right? So I think it's good to take the time to breathe and acknowledge that a lot of us don't have a breath to share anymore, and that a lot of us may not have a breath to share in the next couple of weeks and in the next months. So continuing, I want to talk about barriers, because barriers have defined my pathways as a student, as an Indigenous two-spirited person. I was raised in Quebec, and I've heard a lot about talking about how the tuition fees, we have the lowest tuition fees west of Quebec here in Manitoba. But I haven't heard about the barriers. And a reality for me in the barriers is I have to move to province away to find an education system that would allow me to learn and to grow, and that would allow me to resonate with my value and to choose a path that would help me belonging. And I've chose Winnipeg because Winnipeg seemed to have the most to offer, community-wise and also initiative-wise. I made that decision in 2015 at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission release. And I was really encouraged by all the initiatives that were community-led and activist-led and also university-led. Let's point out that the University of Winnipeg was one of two first university in this country to make mandatory the mandatory requirement for Indigenous course for their students, which is making it easier for me to feel like I belong in a university where people are not taught that my past is shameful, that my past doesn't exist, that the legacy of my family is not something that's invisible anymore in the University of Winnipeg. And that's a really important cultural shift that has been taking place since 2015 in the University of Winnipeg. Other change that has come my way since I moved here is that as soon as I moved here and I started my educational pathways, I've understood that barriers were being built, barriers that I've been trying to escape, barriers that are impacting the most vulnerable, the marginalized communities. They're not impacting the children of our governance because our governance are privileged enough to be in those seats right now today and make those decisions. They're impacting the children of people that have been struggling to free themselves from the oppression of a settler colonial system that we are all part of. And as me, myself being here, I am forced still to place myself in harm's way in front of you. I want to talk about the fear of students because the barriers have been stronger this year, a lot stronger, and the fear has been present. I've been hearing this government talking about fear mongering, and I think it's quite appropriate that it's coming from this government. This year, I was in front of the legislative building in November when we had a teepee raise to protest. And when the government made the decision to remove over $300 million that belonged to Indigenous children in care, were they not vulnerable enough to have access to education? Like, how do you think Indigenous students feel when they saw that decision coming from this government? How do you think they believe that their children after them, their niece and nephew, the youth that are carrying them, their family and their relative that are struggling to take themselves out of the legacy of colonization feel? They'll have even more barriers to access education than the ones that are currently in the university, and that's shameful. I want to talk about the mental health of students. Mental health has been a big buzzword this year, and it's been important even before the pandemic, but now we're all in the same boat. Your government has passed a policy that allow the option of euthanasia when people struggle with mental health don't see the end. That's also put a stress on students and a fear on students. What happens if one of their comrade has a crisis and this is an option that's now offered and available? What happens when you have youth that are struggling and fighting and trying to heal from suicidal ideas, having this offered as an other alternative by your government? How do you think this is not building up the fear of students? I want to talk about our students in education. Our students in education, I've heard in the past week, your minister, your premier, said that once they graduate, they'll have to pay out of pocket the supplies of their careers. How are they not to be afraid once they're going to graduate? What this bill is doing, this bill is giving responsibility to the government to direct the university. It's removing the responsibility from the people, from the community, and from the communities of support that builds those universities. And it's giving it to your provincial government. Are you planning on being responsible with our education? Because you haven't been responsible with the pandemic crisis. And we've had to deal with that, and we hear that every day. We see the number rising up. And this is not fear-mongering, this is reality. When is your government going to be able to look at the reality and address it? We're hearing a lot about Bill 33, and that's going to be better for students, but we want you to do something that's better for students before you promises those and you pass those as law, because they don't. When I read that document, I had a sense of dread. I had a sense of understanding that people like me will not have space in university sectors once your government is finished to do whatever they plan to do with us. I've read the skill and knowledge and talent document, and I was shocked to see that the only inclusion of Indigenous business in there are business that are actively involved in the extraction of our own lands. You want to build labor. You want to align in university and education with the market demands, but there's something you forget. It's about children. It's about dreams. It's about building a new world and a future world. It's about the leaders of tomorrow. Yesterday, you were the student. And tomorrow, the students of tomorrow are scared. They don't have institution where they can depend themselves because they can't access those institutions right now. They have to wear a mask everywhere they go. And it's quite intriguing to see the privilege and the freedom to which this committee has been not wearing masks while we see you in your institution. This is not a privilege that students have been having this year at all. What I want to see is action from this government to answer to the students' fear rather than add to the stress and to the anxiety and to the inconsistency of this government unresponsible answer to the pandemic. I want to see you do real concrete action. And it seems that the only concrete action you've pushed us to the wall to do today is to scrap that bill and tell students that you'll start listening to them and not force them to come at your table to just have a chance to be heard. Because that's not responsible. We should be studying right now. We should be focused on saving our education, not in saving it from you. So I'm going to end my presentation here, but I would like to invite the committee members that would like to ask me questions. Just be mindful of the space that you take. So we don't need to hear your life story. We're still busy struggling and making sure ours is still possible. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Peliquin, for your presentation today and your heartfelt presentation. And I guess, not getting into my life story, but at the same time, wanting to share with you that I want to thank you for coming to Manitoba to do your post-secondary education. And I want to assure you that that the consultations and that the collaboration will continue. I'm not going to name names, but there's some other members of your association, because I'm not quite sure when your presidency finishes, I think at the end of April. But at the same time, or maybe you've got another term, I'm not quite sure, and I apologize for that. But we are going to be setting up a meeting for your association and myself, and so that we can come and have a conversation. And I want you to know also that the collaboration and the meetings that we've had with various student groups over the past years, not just myself, but my predecessors, will definitely continue. I agree with you, breaking down barriers. And again, I know you don't want to hear what my past is and what I did before politics, so I will not share that with you today. But we want to make sure that our post-secondary education is affordable, but also that the institutions are sustainable. And I applaud you for coming to Manitoba, because I think there's going to be more and more Quebecers coming to Manitoba for their education, as well as other Canadians as well. And that's our goal. And you mentioned the skills, talent, knowledge strategy. I think that'll be the next set of questions that the opposition critic will eventually start to talk about. But I think it's a great strategy, and it's about attracting people to Manitoba, because I know that once you get here, and if you can get through a hard winter and a summer with a few mosquitoes, you're going to fall in love with the place, and you're going to want to live out your life here. So with that, thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to meeting you and in person possibly in the future and having a conversation.
Ms. Peliquin.
I'd like to thank the minister for this comment, and also just be truthful on this, that I won't be able to tell Quebecers to come here, because this is the options that were there before that invite me here are not present anymore with this government. I'll have to tell them that if they want to come here with this current government, they'll have to put a cap on their treatment. That's not okay. I also want to acknowledge that the minister has pointed out that I am the University of Winnipeg Student Association outgoing president, and that in the 4 months of your term, I haven't heard anything from you. So I appreciate your comment again. Thank you.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Ms. Peliquin, and thank you for kind of bringing us together, acknowledging the space that we're in, and seeing the importance, stating the importance of education, of opportunities for people, and acknowledging the barriers that so many people like yourself face. I think Bill 33 doesn't even scratch the surface when it comes to dealing with those barriers. And I do hope that at some point the government brings forward and works with groups, students like yourself and groups to come together and put forward legislation that will actually help improve the barriers and remove some of the barriers that you and so many students are facing. I just want to get from your experience and the students that you deal with and work with, and what is, maybe a top 1 or 2 specific barriers you wish the government would address in the legislation?
Ms. Peliquin.
In this legislation of Bill 33, I don't think he's addressing anything that student needs. I think it's just a grab of power. I want the minister to look at healthcare for an international student. I want the minister to look at freeing education services for students that needs it the most, and at stopping creating barriers with this bill. But for that, you have to start looking at the barriers.
Thank you for your presentation. The time for questioning is going to be over, so I will now call on Mr. Jim Clark, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Clark, please proceed with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I've been a resident of Manitoba since 1989 when I was appointed at the University of Winnipeg as a professor of psychology. It's just a coincidence. My father was actually born and raised in Manitoba, although I didn't know him well since he died when I was quite young. I'd like to think that the minister and probably everybody here has the best interests of students at heart, but we probably disagree with respect to how Bill 33 or whether Bill 33 is going to help that. Personally, I think that the advice that the minister and the government's been receiving from organizations like KPMG are misguided ones, and I'll try to explain why briefly. Oh, I should mention, I did submit a written document, and hopefully that'll find its way to the committee in time. Okay, so I think a main focus of discussion has been what is the purpose of Bill 33, and you cannot discern that, I think, from the document itself. So I've gone and looked at some of the other many documents that have been produced relevant to post-secondary education under this government, and I'll just show a couple of the quotes that I've selected. It is expected that Manitoba's post-secondary institutions will become more agile and continuously make changes to their systems in order to be more responsive to the pace of labor market changes. Or from a letter to the University of Manitoba, access to this funding will require your institution to submit a plan that articulates how this funding will be used to orient programs toward labor market needs. So I think this bill is clearly a part and parcel of that larger agenda, and it provides the government with the power to allocate funding in ways that steer students into certain programs. And I think it's important to emphasize that the trust is not just in the minister, but it has to be in this government, as the former speaker mentioned. It'll be at the cabinet table that this decision will be made under the guidance of Premier Pallister, and with input from departments that do not have the best interests of students at heart. So the voice of the minister will only be one of those voices. I looked at the KPMG report, and if you go to page 13 of the report, which is the only page I think the report actually needed, you'll see lots of statistics that demonstrate just how effective the current system is. So to give you some idea, 24 to 34-year-olds in the province are 11% more likely to participate in the labor force than high school graduates. And that's compared to about half that, 6 and 7% for colleges and the trades. The annual salaries, the premium over high school graduates was over $11,000 for universities, about $5,000 for colleges, and about almost $6,000 for trades. Employment rates 3 years after graduation are 94% for universities and 92% for colleges. I'm not exactly sure what the problem is on the student and education side that requires this particular bill or the intervention of the Pallister government into internal operations of autonomous institutions. I should mention that there's many statistics that would confirm this. And with all due respect to the minister, he's appealed several times to the Auditor General's report. The Auditor General did not seem to be aware that there is a huge amount of data available about the general benefits of post-secondary education, including specific programs and including information that's particular to Manitoba. So it's not as though there is some vacuum out there that needs to be filled, presumably by an expensive apparatus that will have to do the job that Stats Canada is already doing. Why KPMG went on and added many more pages is clearly because they had a focus on costs, completely ignoring the benefits that they could have easily calculated, I would imagine. You can take these salary differentials and figure out how much more taxes university graduates pay than they would have paid if they were high school graduates. You could go through and figure out from employment statistics how much fewer social services were required throughout the working life of university graduates and well into retirement. So the current system is working. I think on balance, it probably more than pays for itself when you take a long-term perspective, which systems like a post-secondary system do take, as opposed to perhaps a shorter-term perspective. Okay. So why does it work? It works because employment decisions are complicated. Okay? It's not just a matter of how much money one's going to earn. Okay? It also depends on the aptitudes and interests of students. The minister at the last meeting referred to sitting around the table with his kids and talking about education. Well, that's where decisions should be made. And they shouldn't be overly influenced by a minister on Broadway Street who has decided that he wants, or she, or they want to influence students in ways towards certain occupations. And I don't think even employers benefit from students who are doing things because of the money. Employers want students who are interested and invested in their occupations, not people who are just there to take a paycheck and go home at whatever the hour is and put the job out of their mind. The current system is also successful because students follow many diverse paths to employment. A lot of them, probably about 20 or 30%, will actually go on to further education in professional and graduate programs. So the outcomes for these students won't even be known for years into the future. Okay? In my own case, I had 4 years of undergraduate and 6 years of PhD. How could the University of Western Ontario or the government in Ontario have monitored the effectiveness of the path that I had chosen? Okay. A third reason that things work is because many of the competencies that universities help students develop are in fact generic ones. That's why they can go into so many occupations. And again, look closely at page 13 of the KPMG report. University graduates in Manitoba score higher on literacy and numeracy than do college graduates, and they're higher than university graduates in Ontario and the other Western provinces. I know we have difficulties here with achievement in education, But it's not a problem with the K-12 system that Minister Iwasko worked in, and it's not the problem of the system that I work in at universities. The problems are more fundamental than that and have to do with students who are simply unable to benefit from those systems for a variety of reasons. Another theme that emerges from a lot of these documents is the need to adapt to workplace change in the future. Of course, universities are a large part of what those changes are going to be, both directly and indirectly in terms of educating the entrepreneurs of the future, for example. But more directly, universities have already shown themselves able to adapt to dramatic changes in society. Society has moved from an agricultural-based system to a manufacturing system to a service-based system and to who knows what in the future. Throughout this whole process, universities have expanded their contribution to society and in a highly successful way, as I mentioned just a moment ago. Just to give you some idea of the magnitude of the change, between 1992 and 2018 in Canada, the number of university graduates went from 169,000 to 318,000, an increase of 150,000 or so. There are now over 1.1 million students enrolled in university programs across the country. And universities have accommodated these market changes, maintaining high positive outcomes for large numbers of students, and with a relatively modest increase in the university faculty. So between 1992 and 2018, for example, there was only a 23% increase in the number of full-time faculty.
Mr. Clark, thank you for your presentation. The time allotted for your presentation is over.
Okay.
Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Professor Clark, for your presentation tonight. Again, I thank you for sharing a little bit about your personal story right off the bat, and I'm sorry to hear about that for sure. In regards to the Auditor General's report, I mean, I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to write the Auditor General and give them your feedback on the report, but I think as do everyone, constructive criticism, and as you are, and myself and many other people, we're all lifelong learners. So look forward to hearing more about that. My door is always open, and I really strongly feel that working with students, student groups, faculty, and post-secondary stakeholders here in the province, institutions, is very important, and it's important to me. You've mentioned my background a little bit, and I've seen yours as well. Again, open door is there. Bill 33 is there to make sure that our students enjoy affordability, but at the same time, I mean, you're a professor at the University of Winnipeg. I want to make sure that we have great programming, and that goes with great professors as well. And we need to make sure that our post-secondary institutions are sustainable as well. So Bill 33, I do believe will be bringing a balanced approach to that. And when I do say shoulder check, and I know that there's many fans of mine out there that seem to want to quote my shoulder check thing, but basically is to have those conversations with post-secondary institutions and those that affect absolutely everybody that's involved, and to make sure that the tuition and the student fees and that are at a rate that again remains the lowest in Western Canada, west of Quebec, but at the same time strengthening and making sure that our programming is solid. So thanks again for your time tonight and your presentation.
Mr. Clark.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments from the minister. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a matter of trust or consultation with the minister. The decision will be made at the cabinet table, where the interests of students are not going to be primary. And the minister and other cabinet members will have other things on the agenda. I would also point out that it's not necessary in order to ensure tuition does not increase, or that's affordable, and that the system is high quality, for the minister to be able to not only limit or lower, but also to raise tuitions for some programs. That's simply an undesirable feature of this particular legislation, irrespective of who is in power. And, yeah.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Clark, so much for your presentation. I think it was very informative, and I appreciate the opinion that you brought to your words. I want to ask you about the impacts you're talking about when it comes to different tuitions in classes, for a variety of programs, and especially when the minister talks about it meeting market needs. Very well said that, you know, most of 90+% of students are fully employed after they graduate. And I want to talk about, for you and specifically, how would that impact having that different classes? What do you think the long-term impact would that have on university institutions and on our communities as a whole if we go down that road?
Mr. Clark, and if I can get you to answer just very briefly, because your allotted time is going to be ending. Very respectfully, Mr. Clark, continue.
Yeah, I won't talk in specifics, but in general, I worry about the unintended consequences of this kind of legislation. Imagine there's favoritism for STEM, for example, over non-STEM. Well, a higher percentage of STEM students are male, eh? And a higher percentage of non-STEM are female. How about favoring colleges over universities? Well, students in colleges, if they're male, they make more money, but if they're female, they don't make that much more money. It's university education that's important for female students. And another danger, I think, is flooding the job market. If you favor certain occupations, well, people stay in occupations for 30 or 40 years or more. How are you going to maintain or ensure that from the start of a program till 5 or 6 years later, the jobs are still going to be there and that you haven't already flooded the market? The diversity of the present system is why it works so well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Time questioning is over. I will now call on Mark Gabbert, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
For 30 or 40 years or more. How are you going to maintain or ensure that from the start of a program till 5 or 6 years later, the jobs are still going to be
Mr.
there?
Gabbert, if you can please put your video on.
Sorry, just a second.
Why it works so well.
We could also hear somebody in the background there. So.
Yeah, I know. I don't understand why that's the case, but
Okay, there's your video. We see you now. So please proceed with your presentation, Mr. Gabbert. Continue.
thank you very much. Just to be clear, I'm a private citizen, but I am employed by the University of Manitoba as a member of the history department.
Mr. Gabbert?
Yes.
I'm just getting some notification that you're also listening to the broadcast, and if you can turn that off because we can hear it in the
Yeah,
background.
but I don't understand why that's the case because I don't
Yeah,
understand.
we can hear that from your end. We're hearing an echo. So
I know it's true, but I
do you
can't.
have
I
a
don't know.
web page open, Mr. Gabbert?
Just let me see whether I do. Thank you very much. Now, just to be clear, I'm a private citizen, but I am employed by the University of Manitoba as a member of the history department.
Mr. Gabbert?
Yes. So,
Mr. Gabbert, I'm just going to get some instruction here from the clerk on how to proceed because we're still hearing an echo. Listening to the broadcast, and if you can turn that off because we can hear it in the
yeah,
background.
but I don't understand why that's the case because Yeah, I know,
Yeah, we can hear that from your end, and we're hearing an echo, so.
I know it's true, but I
Do you
can't,
have
I don't know.
a webpage open, Mr. Gabbard?
Just let me see.
I'm going to ask the committee if we can have leave for us to have another presenter. And then we'll come back to Mr. Gabbard once he has the technical issues on his side.
Yeah.
Uh,
I do
Mr. Gabbard,
apologize for
Mr.
this.
Gabbard,
I'll
the,
start-
Mr.
I'll
Gabbard,
start
the
over.
moderator will be in touch with you, and we'll get back to you once we have leave from, correct. Yeah. All right,
Okay.
so leave has been granted to go on to the next presenter, and we will get back to you, Mr. Gabbard. The moderator will contact you. I will now call on Mr. Mike Morose, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Morose, please proceed with your presentation.
Hello, thank you. I want to begin my comments by thanking the committee for the opportunity to be here tonight to be part of the conversation around this incredibly important legislation. I also want to take a moment to commend the other speakers who have given up their time either during the previous 6 hours of presentations or those who have and will speak tonight. Your passion for and commitment to protecting and improving post-secondary institutions and the educational experience they provide students is appreciated by Manitobans. I want to add my voice to their chorus of thanks. I want to let members of this committee also know that I share the specific concerns of the speakers who preceded me. Like them, I'm deeply troubled by what feels at every level to be a clear consolidation of power in the minister's office, giving it broad authority to arbitrarily adjust tuition and student fees without appropriate public oversight. These changes will have the impact of eroding the autonomy of post-secondary institutions and effectively strips them of their ability to chart their own course free of government interference. Equally concerning is the proposed ministerial power that has the potential to limit the ability of student unions to fully advocate for students and programs, or to be the energetic agents of social change we so desperately need them to continue to be. Much of the social progress we've made during the course of my lifetime can trace its roots to young people on our campuses. And I believe it's there on those campuses that our greatest hopes for the future can yet be realized. Now, I'm aware that the minister has indicated that an amendment to address some of these concerns is forthcoming. But the devil is in the detail, and I will remain concerned and vigilant until student organizations believe they have been fully protected by the amendment. The lens I look at this legislation with is that of a longtime public school teacher. And I think it's critical that the committee consider these changes from this perspective. Over my career, I've been privileged to watch several thousands of students pass through my and my colleagues' classrooms and to then follow their progress as they find their place in the world. The subtle differences between students is profound, deeply inspiring, and impossible to truly appreciate unless you've spent time as part of the daily life of a high school. These differences matter within the context of this discussion. Some students clearly understand the path they're meant to travel and attack it with incredible conviction. These students come from two distinctly different backgrounds. The first have emotionally and financially supportive parents and typically come from homes that value higher education because there are others in the family who've benefited from it. As their teacher, I'm concerned about these students, but I understand that this group will, given the deeper resource pools they have to draw on, generally find a way to work through the obstacles that bad public policy puts in front of them. Eventually, they'll get where they want to go. The second group, equally determined and equally sure of the end goal, comes from families of more modest backgrounds, often without a family pattern of post-secondary success to encourage them, or the financial wherewithal to help them cover the significant costs. I'm particularly concerned about this legislation in relation to these students. when combined with this government's pattern of reduced financial support for post-secondary institutions, the removal of the tuition freeze, the proposed ministerial powers to arbitrarily adjust tuition puts this group of students at the greatest risk of being excluded from participation in higher education. Their background makes these students fully aware of the obstacles that challenge their goal of becoming the doctor or lawyer or teacher they want to become, and has clarified the sacrifices they'll be required to make along the way. But these changes to the legislation and the increase in tuition these students will have to pay, and the debt they'll have to shoulder to do so, seriously jeopardizes their decision to even begin the journey. I want to make a point of saying here, because I know it's something that will be raised by the minister when I'm done, that I frankly think is a bit of a disingenuous argument to suggest that the amount of available student loans has been increased during the time of this government, and that somehow, as a result of that, students are better off. But increasing student debt isn't a hand up from a society that understands how it benefits from a better educated population. It's an anchor that pulls too many students under. And students know it, and in the face of it, many of them will simply choose not to go at all. There's a third kind of student that needs to be considered when examining this legislation, and that's those students who are nearing the end of their high school years, but who don't yet know what their passion might be, and who are still trying to determine if post-secondary education is part of their future. For them, it's even more important that the system be both accessible and comprehensive. Participating in higher education has a transformational impact on students. It has the effect of opening them up to the full range of life's possibilities, and it helps make those uncertain paths clear. Countless students, and teachers will validate this, countless students then go on, not knowing where they were going to begin, to make incredible contributions to society, contributions they themselves didn't know they could make. For these students, the additional danger in the proposed legislation is that it gives the minister the discretion to create classes of tuition that vary from course to course and program to program. Such discretion opens the door to some programs being more valued and having their tuition protected, while others are simply tuitioned out of existence because they don't themselves necessarily lead directly to employment. The programs most at risk are the very ones that these students enroll in to begin their voyage of discovery. I've heard the minister describe this as simply a shoulder check. And frankly, my skepticism is rooted in a concern as to what it is exactly you're shoulder checking for. If it's to ensure the financial stability necessary to maintain a world-class accessible system, the simplest way to do that is to fully fund it at the rate of inflation and growth. You've chosen not to do that, which leads me to believe that what you're looking for is a sign from friends in industry about the kinds of employees they prefer. Your claim is that it's the former. Your behavior suggests it's probably the latter. In conclusion, I've been in and around public policy development and social action my entire adult life. I very much want to believe that this committee represents a critical step in a thoughtful and reflective legislative process. But to believe that, I must first accept that this discussion and the concerns raised within it will become part of a meaningful process of consultation that results in the fine-tuning of policy to ensure that it matches the needs of all stakeholders. After listening to the discussion on Tuesday and the response of speakers so far, I'm disappointed to discover that this process is viewed as little more than a hoop that must be jumped through in order to pass legislation as it exists. I encourage you to do better.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Morose, for your presentation. And you started off talking about the the fact on Manitoba's democracy and your rights, and then you finish that off as well, talking about the ability and that this is part of the process. That's why I think Manitoba is a great place to absolutely live, because you're able to come. I do believe we're probably the only legislature in all of Canada that allows a committee stage where the public are able to come and voice their opinions, which I think is great, and I thank you for coming and exercising that right. I do agree that the student union's mandate and amendment, if you stay up with us later tonight, we will be bringing forward an amendment to make sure that the clarity of the bill, all along the intent of the bill was to not interfere with student unions or associations' fees that they vote on through their democratic processes. But that wasn't clear to the student groups that I met with. So thanks to them for reaching out and having great consultative meetings with myself, and we're bringing forward an amendment later tonight. I also agree with you that a debt is not a good thing and should never be the number one thing to go out and get loans or rack up credit cards. And I also agree with you that that post-secondary institutions should be accessible and, of course, affordable. So thanks again for attending tonight and sharing your thoughts with us.
Mr. Morose.
Great, I appreciate all of that. But again, for this committee process to have the value it ought to have, then amendments based on the concerns raised by people here at committee need to be considered, need to be made, and legislation needs to be adjusted to make sure it's balanced and covers all of those concerns. And as I say, I'm not certain, based on what I've heard so far, that that's very likely.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Mraz, for your time this evening and bringing forward your presentation. You mentioned the concerns around differential tuition and the impacts that might have on our community. I'm very interested in that specifically because I think it'll have a really critical impact in Manitoba post-secondary. I think the minister failed to address that when he responded to you and asking a question about differential classes of tuition, and I'd prefer if the minister could take the opportunity to do that when he has the next available time to speak. But my question is for you as someone who is an educator, and thank you for your time educating our kids in the K-12 system. For your students and looking at their futures, what do you think the changing of tuition between different programs would have an impact on their choices and their future?
Mr. Morose.
Yeah, it's a serious struggle for students, particularly those that don't know yet where they want to go, right? Some of it is a bit of a voyage of discovery, and that's part of the role of post-secondary institutions, is to allow people to discover the things that they can be passionate about, and then make decisions based on where those passions might lead them. The problem with some of the programs that will be targeted or could be targeted is that they're the ones that are the entry-level ones. They're the introduction to psychology. They are the programs like that in a general arts program that draw people in and inspire them to go on. And raising fees on those because in the short term or they don't offer jobs automatically as an outcome, then limits where those students can go afterwards. And they may then decide not to go at all.
Mr. Altemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mraz, for your presentation tonight. Mr. Mraz, as a private citizen, what do you want to see from this government to amend this particular legislation, and what direction would you want that to go in?
Mr. Mraz, I don't want to cut you off abruptly, but if you could just answer your question very briefly as your time is running out. So go ahead.
Yeah. Sure, thank you. Yeah, there have been a ton of excellent suggestions from speakers over the course of the 2 days. Everything from finding other ways to protect student fees to making sure that that the legislation allows the institutions to make decisions on their own without government interference, to go where they believe is best for the students, but a willingness to consider amendments, comprehensive amendments where necessary, as your guests, as your presenters have offered. For me, that's what I want to see is a willingness to discuss what's best for the system as a whole. And as I say, so far, I haven't seen that.
Thank you for your presentation. The time for questioning is over. We will now call on Mr. Mark Gabbert and ask the moderator to invite them back into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Welcome back, Mr. Gabbert. Please proceed with your presentation.
Sorry for the earlier noise. As I said before, I'm appearing as a private citizen, but I'm a member of the Department of History at the University of Manitoba. In my view, this piece of legislation represents a major erosion of what remains of the autonomy of Manitoba's post-secondary institutions. In my comments, I'll refer mainly to the University of Manitoba, of course, but I think what I have to say applies generally. Consider for a moment how much power the government currently has with respect to these institutions. At Manitoba, the government has oversight, appoints the majority of the Board of Governors. That board has oversight of the administration of the university, and it has the power to approve most of the University Senate's decisions on academic matters. The government also has the power to determine what the university's annual operating grant will be. It has the power to determine the overall level of increase in tuition fees that the university may impose to make up for shortfalls in the grant. A grant which now it continues to decline, constitutes just over 50% of the university's operating budget. And in fact, thanks to the government's control over the past 4 years, the grant has declined in value by about 13%, with the result that the burden of tuition for students has increased significantly. Until the passage of the Advanced Education Administration Act in 2014, the government's relations with the university were buffered by the existence of quasi-independent boards. These boards were created to protect the autonomy of the university against direct interventions from the minister over issues related to funding and programming, which needed to be decided by academics. The Council on Post-Secondary Education was the most recent of these bodies, which was abolished in 2014. Its predecessor was the more robust Universities Grants Commission, which had been known to go as far even as to approve program proposals that the government itself had resisted. The government appointed these commissions and provided a sum for the support of post-secondary education, but it was up to the intermediary bodies to deal directly with the universities on matters of programming and allocation of the grant. Unfortunately, these arm's length bodies are a thing of the past. Their functions have basically been handed over to the minister through provisions of the Advanced Education Administration Act, which is now, amendments to which are now before us here. This act moves the intermediaries out of the way, giving the government of the day a much more direct influence in the development of the province's post-secondary education system. This increases the danger that decisions affecting the development of post-secondary education will be politicized, and that academic and pedagogically oriented decisions will be sidetracked. These days, rather than dealing with COPSI, for example, the university's vice president for programs deals directly with officials of the relevant government department. There is no independent mediator to buffer ministerial power. And this is a standing threat to the academic integrity of the university and to the range of programs and courses that the university can provide to the people of Manitoba, not just the young people, but primarily them, but all Manitobans. So if we look at the situation now, in addition to the control over membership of the board, the level of the operating grant, tuition, and so on, the minister has acquired a range of other powers, among them establishing directions and priorities, quote, for the funding given to the sector, and where it deems necessary, imposing performance measures to assure the proper use of the grant. More importantly, the minister has also got the power now to approve or not approve both the introduction of new programs and the significant modification or closure of existing ones. And according to section 11.2.1 of the Act, the exercise of these powers can be fine-tuned through the imposition of regulations without any parliamentary discussion. Now, these provisions, of course, themselves infringed upon the powers of the board and the Senate at the University of Manitoba, which were empowered through the University of Manitoba Act to the board, in the case of the board, the right to abolish or establish schools and faculties, and the University Senate's right to establish the university's academic programs and to decide how to give credit to people who have studied elsewhere. But for all that the Advanced Education Administration Act risks politicizing academic questions, the legislation still affirms the principles that the autonomy of the universities has to be respected. Thus, one of the roles of the minister is to promote a system of advanced education that, quote, respects the appropriate autonomy of educational institutions and the recognized principles of academic freedom, end quote. This is emphasized again in section 2.6 of the current act, where it is stipulated that, quote, in carrying out his or her role and responsibilities, the minister must have regard for the respective autonomy of educational institutions. In light of this language, of course, the meaning of Bill 33, I think, becomes clearer. Remember, this bill is an act to amend the Advanced Education Administration Act. It does so in a way that both ignores and weakens the Act's provisions, recognizing the basic institutional autonomy of universities as a boundary that must not be crossed. Instead, not satisfied with the considerable powers that it already enjoys, the government now plans to intervene directly in the allocation and setting of tuition levels among the various faculties and programs of the universities. It knows that these interventions violate the current language and spirit of the Advanced Education Administration Act. So it now prepares to widen or to weaken that language by amendments that would further erode the autonomy of universities and to arrogate to itself decisions that will have enormously important impacts on the university's programming. Bill 33 permits the government to set whatever tuition fees it wants in a given university program or across programs. Such intervention in the price charged to students for particular courses of study increases the government's power over the university programs and its academic priorities, inevitably. It impacts the internal allocation of resources in unprecedented ways. And it will clearly have a big impact on the kind of, the range of choices that students can have. Why do this? Well, some of these possible reasons have already been mentioned. First, of course, if the government has a particular view that the labor market needs one particular field more than another, it might well decide to discourage enrollment in some fields and encourage it in others. And of course, it will be a disincentive for students to enroll, and in some cases make it impossible. The previous speaker has spoken very eloquently about the range of ways in which students come to conclusions about how they want to spend the rest of their lives by having access to a range of programs. So this is a very important aspect of the matter. And I think it needs to be said to this committee, and since I'm a member of the University of Manitoba's Senate Planning and Priorities Committee, I can say that whenever the university considers significant program changes in any area, it always considers the labor market situation. But along with that consideration goes a serious concern for the impact of any changes we're likely to make on the overall quality and diversity of the university's educational offerings. One of the factors in that regard is a concern for providing to Manitobans of all ages with opportunities for learning in a wide range of fields relevant to the extraordinary range of purposes that learning serves. Such learning may be directly or indirectly relevant to a student's ultimate labor force participation, but what is certain is that the programs will have been carefully vetted by members of a community of academics who have a lot of experience and who I can attest are deeply committed to the public of Manitoba and to their students. It would simply not be appropriate to impose financial disincentives to these sorts of programs for political reasons. But there's a further danger presented by the bill, and it's this. By permitting the government to regulate tuition fees of particular programs, the provision risks inviting government retaliation against programs that are critical of current accepted opinion or institutions, including, of course, the political views and priorities of whatever government might be in power.
Mr. Gabbard? Mr. Gabbard, your 10 minutes are up for your presentation, so thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Gabbard, for coming on tonight and giving us your presentation. And I more than appreciate your views on the topic. Of course, just to remind you that, and I know you know this probably, but I'm just going to state it back on the record that COPSI and the change in legislation in 2014 was under a previous government. And in regards to Bill 33, those conversations are going to be happening in regards to the tuition and the student fees. When you talk about the autonomy, as other presenters had done so, I believe that there's a tad bit, and I'm not saying you're intending to do this, but I think unintended consequences of potentially a little bit of fear-mongering on that fact is that we are going to have those conversations with those post-secondary institutions, and the post-secondary institutions are going to be bringing forward to my department those potential changes, whether it's an increase or a decrease to tuition and student fees. And at the end of the day, Mr. Gabbard, we are all accountable to the taxpayer, and making sure that there's oversight, I don't think is a bad thing. I think the status quo that has been going on within Manitoba for years and years and years, I think has shown that there has been a bit of a detriment. And so I think some oversight and making sure that the student success is paramount, and that just means that our programming is strong, but also affordable. So thank you again for attending tonight and bringing forward your presentation.
Mr. Gabbard.
Nothing in the bill has anything clear about consultations, any obligation to consult or anything else. And in the end, you keep the hammer, even when you consult. As for the taxpayers, of which I am one, they expect to get what they're paying for, not some kind of hyped up job training that is, based on some temporary or short-term considerations about what people really need. It's clear that, as the last speaker said, nobody's paying any attention to the serious criticisms that people are bringing to the floor here. As for COPSI, I know all about COPSI. We fought with the other government over COPSI. I'm not blaming you for everything that's happened. I'm blaming you for making it worse. And I'm telling you, you think you want to have a shoulder check? Wake up. You're going the wrong way on a one-way street. Shoulder checks do you no good.
Mr. Altemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Gabbard, for your presentation tonight. I'm just going to get right to it. Do you see anything in this bill that will improve the student experience in Manitoba?
Mr. Gabbard.
Absolutely not. It has nothing to do with what students might or might not want or profit from. It's obviously driven by something else. There's no fixing this bill. It needs to be junked. It undercuts anything that's good about the current Advanced Education Administration Act. And it's deliberately designed to do so. And so all the loose talk about consultations and the rest, and the taxpayers are really seriously wide of the mark, not to mention the references to traffic regulations.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you again for your presentation. I think I really appreciate hearing your perspective, and the immediacy of some of the issues here I think is very evident by hearing you speak. I want to ask, and again, I think the ministers failed to address it now. I think you're at least the third presenter tonight who has brought up the issues around differential classes of tuition, and I think this is an opportunity for the minister to really clarify. He claims fear-mongering, but he's yet to clarify what that really means, what the impacts are going to be. From your perspective, reading the bill, what do you think that section of the bill means as it stands right now?
Well,
Mr. Gabbert, if you can answer very briefly, so
Yes,
because
perfectly, I will.
you're running out of time, Mr. Gabbert, if you could just answer very briefly, thank you.
It's perfectly clear that the bill allows the government to make these kinds of differential fees, and everything that the previous person said about the problem with them is correct, and a lot more. It will destroy the program, an academic program that has been carefully worked together over many, many years. Very, very worrying. Not fear-mongering.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbert, for your presentation. That completes Mr. Gabbert's presentation. Before we move on to the next presenter, I just want to let you know that we've also received written submissions from the following people on Bill 33. The moderator has distributed an electronic copy to all virtual committee members, and a hard copy will be provided to all members present in the committee room from Evelyn Milken, private citizen, Katinka Stasina, private citizen, Michelle Faubert, private citizen, Othniel Harris from the Canada Sierra Leone Friendship Society, Tim Podolsky, private citizen, and Tendai Dogo, private citizen. Does the committee agree to have these documents appear in the Hansard transcript of this meeting? Agreed? Agreed, and so ordered. We will now move on to the next presenter, Shirley Thompson, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Thompson will be dropped to the bottom of the list for now, and we will now call on Whitney Hodgkins, Chair of Manitoba League of Persons with Disability. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Hodgkins, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. As the chair had mentioned, my name is Whitney Hodgins, and I am the chairperson for MLPD. I'm also an alumni of Brandon University in the class of 2020, coming to you live from Treaty 2 territory in Brandon, Manitoba. In my past, I was a student from 2012 to 2020, so a long time as a student. Over that time, I was an active member on the Brandon University Students' Union, Canadian Federation of Students Manitoba, and I was last in legislature speaking against Bill 31 in 2017. Brandon University, however, became my second home away from home, where I have shared my proudest of accomplishments, such as becoming the first BU student in the school's history to win the prestigious Future Leader of Manitoba Award. The accomplishments I had while being a student at BU was what shaped me into the individual I am today. But this would not have been possible without the supports and services offered by the university and the Students' Union. But these are the things that are also the very things that are being put at risk with Bill 33. Although I commend the government for stating publicly and in this committee they intend on making an amendment that would make student unions and associations exempt from this bill's structure, we have not seen the language of this amendment, and so it makes it hard to provide input on the amendment being a good thing for students. But services offered by the institutions themselves are not safe from this bill. It will be placing services that students depend on at risk, and these services are life-saving for those who need them. I know this because I was both a student living in poverty and a person living with a disability that depended on those services to be there when I needed them. Services that are provided to students through this department include mental health supports, disability services, tutoring, writing centers, library, career and academic planning services, and much more. These are financially sustained either through the provincial funding they are given each year, student fees, or a combination of the two. And this also varies from institution to institution. It's these services specifically which stand to be significantly impacted if this bill were to be passed, because we have already seen cuts happen over the last 5 years to institutional budgets, tuition raised by 20% in the last 4 years to make up the difference on the backs of students such as myself. And there have been changes behind the scenes that me as a young leader that I made this a primary issue for me today when addressing Bill 33. Furthermore, this bill is also aiming to centralize the power of how fees and tuition is decided by the minister. And although the minister said last committee meeting that they're a man of their word, I worry about the fact that he will not be minister forever, and the next minister may have an entirely different attitude and bias with regards to post-secondary education. And nowhere in this bill does it state where the line gets drawn. It's centralized power, but it's also incredibly high risk and places universities even further at the mercy of the government than they were before this bill was introduced. And it's these gaps that are way too many and way too far in between that can be simply ignored. It's this reality that will most certainly push accessibility for post-secondary education away from persons with disabilities. This is because students living with disabilities require these services to thrive in the post-secondary environments, complete their studies, and enter the workforce. Additionally, those services are vital now more than ever in the middle of this pandemic when unemployment runs rampant. We are in an economy that increasingly is requiring post-secondary education in order to enter the workforce. It's becoming clear now more than ever that education is no longer a luxury. In fact, it's a necessity. It's already difficult enough to have to go through university living with a disability because disproportionately many have financial barriers or struggles when accessing it. It's even harder to stay in institutions if they cannot support students with disabilities that have equitable access to services, such as those that are currently provided by institutions and student unions. If these services didn't exist, the result could lead to a student living with a disability dropping out, transferring to a school that supports them outside the province, or giving up on the pursuit entirely because the costs are too high to continue. Although these are realistic examples of what is happening before Bill 33, this bill, combined with the pandemic, could increase the odds of these situations happening more even frequently. When we say that we are trying to save students money and trying to make education accessible, it comes at the significant cost of people who are underprivileged. And I sat for 6 hours last time, and the message from the government that they wish to tell us over and over is that this bill will make universities accessible and affordable. But it also calls into question this clear misunderstanding between affordability and accessibility. Accessibility is not the same as affordability. Accessibility is leveling the playing field so that everyone can access resources and services to live their best lives and achieve their full potential, while affordability is having a product or service at the best price. One thing about affordability, though, is that the lower the cost of the product, it doesn't always mean that it's the best quality or even that it's accessible. There comes a line where less cost also decreases accessibility. And when we aim for affordability and use it as a reason to argue for accessibility, it hinders accessibility for students living with disabilities. If we are to have legislation like the Accessibility for Manitobans Act in place that addresses these issues on paper, we need to also make investments in places that support those who wish to get themselves out of poverty and into the workforce. That starts with having good investments in our publicly funded institutions like Brandon University. There are many people living with disabilities today who would love the opportunity to access college or university, but they're never given the opportunity to do so because of how many barriers are in their way today. And Bill 33 could potentially just be another barrier to add to the rest of the barriers that exist in deterring people from accessing post-secondary education. If you would like one success story of someone pulling themselves out of poverty, going back to school, going into the workforce on the front line of this pandemic, and also attempting to go back to school in the middle of a pandemic, look no further than at me. I'm one of those people. As I said before, I would not have been successful had it not been for the supports and services provided by both my union and my university. Nor would I have been successful if people and systems in place didn't give me a chance and see me as more than just a label. But when you support bills such as those as Bill 33, you are supporting the ideology that people living with disabilities don't deserve access to supports that would make them successful, nor do you support those who make it their mission and their goal to make it a possibility, which is also known as systemic ableism today. This government and its minister claims that we are accountable to our province's taxpayers. However, I would counter with saying that you should also invest in your future taxpayers as well. Thank you for taking the time to hear my presentation, and I will take any questions that you might have at this time.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Hodgins, for your presentation. I took copious amount of notes, even though I know that we're going to get answered in the next few days here as well. As you've said earlier, that I have said publicly in regards to bringing forward the amendment later tonight. As far as to release the exact verbiage on that amendment would be out of scope for the process for the bill. So that's why it hasn't been before tonight. But I can assure you that it will be protecting any type of student fees set by unions and associations that vote on their student fees through their own democratic process. I did want to also thank and also agree with you in regards to education is absolutely the key for a better future for all, not only Manitobans, but for all, for every human being as far as I'm concerned as well. And I agree, and I don't want to I didn't ever want to simplify, holy smokes, the fact on the accessibility and the affordability, and I appreciate your feedback on that. But that is definitely the goals of not only Bill 33, but of our government. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, the critic, Mr. Moses.
Ms. Hodgins.
Thank you for your feedback, Minister Wasco. But I would also say that as much as you have mentioned that you do plan on making an amendment, you still do not protect the services that the university themselves offers students. So it's great that you're protecting student associations and student unions, but I'm also saying right now that the services offered by our institutions outside of that are not protected either. And that is also a huge concern of mine, because people with disabilities and mental illnesses, those are the services that those institutions are providing, not the student unions.
Mr. Moses.
Ms. Hodgins, thank you so much for your presentation. It's wonderful to hear such articulation about the issues, and especially representing your experience at Brandon University. Thinking about Brandon University and the impacts that this bill would have on BU, which is smaller than U of M and U of W, and thinking about the potential of tuition increasing higher on arts programs, which I know is very popular at BU. What do you think that would do for enrollment? Do you think that would have a major impact on students who attend BU and students who are looking to get post-secondary education in the Westman area?
Ms. Hodgins.
I would answer that most definitely it would impact enrollment for sure in those specific programs, because I myself have looked at enrollment numbers. In fact, our university deans used to make a competition out of how high their enrollment numbers are between science and arts. And one of the things that for me personally, I come from a small department with very few majors in it, as a double major with two small departments actually. And I feel like with this bill being introduced, those departments could be very likely extinguished because it's not in line with educational outcomes, as it were.
Mr. Altamar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Hodgins, for your presentation this evening. It's certainly great to get a Western Manitoba perspective on post-secondary education in Manitoba. I'll get right into it again with you. What's being put at risk here by Bill 33?
Ms. Hodgins.
I would say there's a lot being put at risk here with Bill 33. Even though there has been a proposal for an amendment, that language, as I said before, hasn't been produced yet, so I can't really provide comment on it. But when I talk about services, those are things that, to me, are probably the biggest impact, because those are the services that students go to when they need help, in addition to what is provided by student unions in addition to that. When I was a student at BU, I wasn't using one side or the other, I was using them holistically. And so when you take one to protect one and not the other, well, you've literally taken people who use crutches and you've taken one crutch away. And what's the person going to do? They're going to fall down because they're not balanced.
Ms. Hawkins, thank you for your presentation. This concludes your time for questioning. I will now call on Dane Monkman, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Mr. Monkman, please proceed with your presentation.
Tanze Boju, Gijebabe Magazine, Indigenous Cause. Dane Monkman, Ntisnakason. My name is Dane Monkman, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Manitoba and studying political studies. My studies focus on Canadian government relations with Indigenous peoples, constitutional matters, and treaties. I would like to begin my time today by stating that I am here to speak against the Advanced Education Administration Amendment Act. I would also like to address first some false statements that have been made by the minister in his responses to speakers in committee presentations. There are a number of ways which Bill 33 is actually similar to the Student Choice Initiative in Ontario, which has gone on to be challenged in the courts. These similarities include the addition of a student fee definition, the ability of the minister to prohibit compulsory student fees, the ability of the minister to issue guidelines in respect to student fees, the ability of the minister to set a student fee at a specific amount, and the ability of the minister to deduct any amount of student fees paid in excess of the guidelines from the grants provided to the university or college. I would also like to address the fact that the minister has continually claimed to have consulted students on these matters. As an Indigenous person and as a student of governmental affairs, I would like to remind the committee that consultation is certainly not equal to consent. Regardless of what Minister Owasco's claims and responses may have implied, the supposed consultations that took place in regards to Bill 33 are not even adequate to claim that students have been consulted. I cannot say for certain, as I was not a part of the consultations that may or may not have taken place at the University of Manitoba, but perhaps it is worthy to remind that consulting with the University of Manitoba Campus Conservative Group is certainly not enough to claim adequate consultation. I'm here to say today that regardless of the consultations that have taken place, students who have presented to this committee during the end of term crunch and during a pandemic have shown that there is a great deal wrong with this bill. The amendment that you have continually brought up is still not enough. For the good of current students and future students in Manitoba, I urge you to please scrap this bill and If you feel the need to further legislate on this matter, hold broad and accessible consultation with students and universities in a substantive way. I would also like to say that the strategy that the government has put out in regards to post-secondary education is truly worrying. We have seen the statistics and the effects of austerity on the outcomes of education, and the strategy that this government has committed to, as well as the legislation in regards to education on all levels, cannot be described as anything other than deeply damaging. I know that many MLAs have received their education and directly benefited as a result from our post-secondary education system in Manitoba. It cannot be described as anything other than an attack on current and future students to further defund and offload the costs of education onto individuals who seek to better themselves and their society through a higher education. This legislation is best understood through the analogy of legislators kicking away a ladder of education that they have climbed to their own success. After they have achieved their personal goals, they are then making it harder or impossible for later students to climb that same ladder. I am also an Indigenous student, as I have mentioned, and one who has benefited in the past from the funding provided to me through my band. A direct result of the changes that this legislation proposed and the previous removal of the tuition freeze has been that Indigenous peoples will see fewer and fewer enrollments in post-secondary education, even those who benefit from band funding will lack access to post-secondary education in this province. This does not sound like an effective way to address the province's role in achieving the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding educational gaps faced by Indigenous students. I am also a graduate student, as I have mentioned, and this is also where I see a large flaw in Bill 33 and the province's strategy on post-secondary education. Bill 33 creates different classes of fees, which would allow for favoritism in the funding of post-secondary programs. When combined with the provincial post-secondary education strategy, this will harm graduate students who have continually fought for better funding to programs and students. Students will have to pay more, and their programs will not grow or offer more supports. Funding is not getting easier for students to access, but harder. And this is only from the perspective of domestic students. International students, who are more represented in graduate programs, pay around 4 times the amount that domestic students do in ancillary fees, have less access to program funding, and cannot access all of the same supports that domestic students do, such as healthcare. This strategy of attempting to predict labor market demands is not only a near impossible task, as this pandemic has shown, but is also unequally detrimental to graduate students, as graduate programs are not often aligned with what this government has deemed as essential for the labor market. This is not only bad for students, but is bad for the academic freedom of universities. Ultimately, I am here tonight to speak to my experience, but in doing so, I cannot help but also advocate for others who are not able to be here during a pandemic and at the end of an academic term. I must address my own position in this issue as well, as I did not come from a background of great wealth. My family did not have a fund for me or my older sister to access post-secondary education. My mother died of cancer when I was 13, and because of that, it became harder for me, myself, and my older sister to attend university. It is happily something that we were able to do, but it was not something that came to us easily or accessibly. As I did receive band funding in my undergraduate degree, I can be grateful to no extent to the band for this fund, but because of the cost of graduate studies, I was not able to receive the same funding. The band would much rather and reasonably provide it to more students who would be able to access at least some level of academic or post-secondary studies or academic success. I would also say that being a student, especially a grad student, is not easy. It is an uphill battle, and we do not need further hindrance to the educational outcomes that this government is continually showing. I would also say that in regards to the shoulder checks that the minister has continually brought up during these meetings and presentations, I certainly do not see it as a shoulder check, but instead a body check, one that you would see in a hockey game between the government and students and universities. And it is not a forward-thinking action, but instead an action that seeks to harm and further cut funding towards universities and students. I'd like to thank you for my time.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Monkman, for attending tonight, having your voice heard here, and giving us your presentation. And I also want to thank you very much for sharing your personal story. I know it's tough at times to be able to do that, but I think we all are better people when we understand where certain people are coming from. A couple comments just quickly. I agree with you as far as making sure that our post-secondary institutions remain accessible and affordable. You know, much like you mentioned that it's more difficult to access post-secondary education. I know with working within the school system myself for quite a few years and working with students, being a guidance counselor, and you know, one way or another, what their options were after secondary school, is the fact that our government actually has been listening to students and took that money from after you graduate to actually putting it to the forefront. And you know, we've got roughly $30 million in scholarships and bursaries. I know one of the previous presenters weren't happy when I mentioned the over $64 million on Manitoba student loans, which are interest-free. But I hear you. I mean, at times it's tough to access those funds. So depending on the type of occupation you get after completing your post-secondary, I think the repayment plan here in Manitoba is actually second to none in regards to Manitoba student loans, and the ability to access those funds, I think have actually become easier over the last 5 years for sure. With that, again, I want to thank you for doing the presentation. As far as the student groups that I've had the pleasure of meeting with, and then making some adjustments to the bill through working with them, and I mean, I guess, you know, MAPS represents well over, you know, 60,000 students, and CFS Manitoba tells me that they represent over 45,000 students. So to me, I mean, they're voices of quite a few students here in the province of Manitoba. But I also want to state that, you know, those consultations don't stop there, and they have to continue. So again, thank you very much for attending, and good luck with your graduate studies.
Mr. Monkman.
I would like to thank you for your well wishes in my graduate studies, but I would also say that as previous presenters have mentioned, I think that it is sort of inadequate to say that the loans that have been offered to students are adequate in providing funding, as many people have said before me, and many will say afterwards, that loans are actually another barrier to entry. Many students do not get past the actual taking of a loan to access that education. I would also say that on your consultations with MAPS, this organization that as a student of the University of Manitoba, I have not heard of. And with CFS, of which actually I have previously worked with and currently work with, we have not felt that you have consulted us on these matters, but instead dictated to us the changes that you are planning to make, regardless of our voice. I think that that's all I can really say. I know that everyone else on the provincial executive of the Canadian Federation of Students would agree with me that your consultations are inadequate.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monkman, for your presentation, taking time out of your busy schedule here at the end of your school year and your dedication to our democratic process. You mentioned, again, the kind of a little bit about the differential tuition that could be faced as a result of Bill 33, which I think the minister, again, I think for the fourth time tonight, Speaker has brought that up and the minister has failed to address or comment exactly what that means. So I hope the minister sincerely takes that opportunity in the next opportunity. Also, I just wanted to point out and correct the minister, or at least ask for clarity from the minister. He did mention $30 million in scholarships. I really want the minister to clarify if that's all public money or if what percentage or what portion of that is corporate sponsored scholarships as opposed to public dollars. So just a little clarification if the minister has a chance. But Mr. Monkman, I did want to ask you to get to your own story about your own personal journey and what the accessibility of post-secondary means to you. You talked a little bit about your band funding, and I'm wondering that if tuition increases, as it looks like, as we've seen over the past few years, and as is likely as a result of Bill 33, what that would mean for accessibility for you and other people that you know who are looking at going to university or college.
So, Mr. Monkman, we've actually ran out of time for you to reply, but I'm going to get to reply very briefly. Go ahead, Mr. Monkman.
Thank you. In regards to the sort of increase in tuition and the effects on, say, band funding, every time that tuition goes up, say with inflation or whatever amount that is set by the province, 5%, for example, because of the way the funding works from the federal government to bands to send students to post-secondary school, there will be, say, a 5% increase in tuition and a 5% decrease in the amount of students who can enroll from that same amount of funds. It's as simple as that. And in my previous mentions to previous ministers of education, there has been no sort of acknowledgement that this is directly harming the amount of Indigenous students that can be enrolled in Manitoba.
Thank you, Mr. Monkman, for your presentation. The time for questioning is over. I will now call on Hannah Mahaichuk Marshall, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
Hello, everyone.
Good evening, Ms. Marshall. Please proceed with your presentation.
All right, so firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, original land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and homeland of the Métis Nation. So before I begin, I do hope that the minister will actually listen to what I say and not accuse me of spreading misinformation, as he had done with many of my fellow speakers, with students, with advocacy groups, pretty much anyone that opposes this bill. So saying that, I am a university student in Manitoba, yet I have taken hours to join you here at committee. That is time away from my studies. And I'm here to demand that you scrap this bill in entirety. This bill is an egregious overreach of power. It is borderline abusive to Manitoba post-secondary institutions, and by extension, their students. Post-secondary institutions are autonomous. While they are partially funded by the province, they are not at the whim of this government. The main problem with this bill is it could only be benign, if not still paternalistic, if it was in the hands of the right people. This government has proven themselves over and over again to not be those people. I say that because this government has been constantly waging a relentless attack on education on every level. Take Bill 64, for example. Except with 33, you are stripping universities of their control. And with Bill 64, you're doing that to elected school boards. The outcome of both is the same. Manitoba students suffer. As some of my fellow speakers have mentioned, if the minister does so choose, he could raise tuition for certain programs such as the arts or social sciences. Those are faculties overwhelmingly dominated by female students. This would hurt them, and it is not out of the realm of possibility because the minister has said that he will prioritize job-creating programs. That is something that the minister himself has suggested, and it has been tried in other places. This has been tried in Australia, and guess what? It was bad. This clearly shows that the minister does not see the value of education in onto itself, but rather only as far as it serves the economic interests of this province. Minister, you have suggested that the goal of this legislation is to keep post-secondary education accessible and affordable and to keep tuition fees low. Why would we ever believe you when your own government removed the safeguard that was already in place to do that? What happened then? Tuition skyrocketed by 18% because of course it did. Not only that, but you have actively cut provincial funding to post-secondary institutions in every one of your budgets by a cumulative total of 13%. What would possibly make you think that a university would not need to compensate with tuition hikes? And if you won't pay, then of course it'll be Manitoba students that have to pick up the check. It is absolutely ridiculous for a minister to decide how much money a university needs to properly operate and support its students. The people already working in that field know a lot better than this government. This austerity-driven government cannot be trusted because they are only interested in cost savings, and that is not what makes the most sense for the operation of a university. This bill is grossly paternalistic and not only dictating what a post-secondary institution needs, but actually punishing it for disagreeing. If a university has the audacity to charge the student fees it needs to operate and properly support those students, the provincial government can then claw back funding from them. You have cut funding to post-secondary institutions, you have raised tuition fees, and you have stripped international students of their healthcare, and you have scrapped the tuition rebate. You have no intention of making post-secondary education more accessible and affordable when your actions say otherwise. And even though it just irks the minister to have this legislation compared to Doug Ford's Student Choice Initiative, the similarities are undeniable. Both of them are gross government overreaches into the post-secondary field. Both aim to strip universities and colleges of their autonomy by interfering with student fees. And I was actually a student in university in Ontario when Doug Ford did this, and it was a disaster. Your bill gives you that same power to make student fees optional, but we shouldn't quibble about how dissimilar or similar the pieces are. Instead, let's look at why the courts ruled against Doug Ford. It was because provincial governments do not have the right or the authority to interfere with autonomous institutions, which is exactly what a university and a college is. They are autonomous. This government's ideas on how education should work in this province come from one, a far-right bill mill, the American Legislative Exchange Commission, and two, Doug Ford. Save us the time, money, energy, and frankly, the embarrassment, and scrap this bill right now. You have touted several times that you have been listening to students. You say you had meetings with students and stakeholders and offered them technical briefings, but that was after the fact. As far as I can see, students are telling you that they were not consulted and that that is unacceptable. It is absolutely absurd to brag about that, since the meetings came after you tabled this legislation without consulting them at all. Just the fact that they demanded you clarify which student fees you are attacking here shows that this legislation was so poorly thought out that that wasn't made clear from the get-go. Additionally, bragging, like some of my other speakers have brought up, bragging about how your government has provided $60 million of loans to post-secondary students is not the flex you think it is. You have put $60 million worth of debt on the backs of Manitoba students because of your own actions, because you made tuition more expensive, because you cut the rebate, because you made it impossible for them not to have to go further and further into debt. So to reiterate my earlier point, the only way that these enormous overreaching powers could possibly be benign would be if they were in the hands of the right people, if they were in the hands of people that actually wanted to keep tuition low, which you have demonstrated you do not, and if it was actually reasonable in any way to try to dictate what kind of programs would be favorable to the economy. I value education based on its own merit. I do not go to university to serve your economy. And so I cannot stress enough how unacceptable it is to try to grant yourself these kinds of powers, and then also to try to convince us that you won't use them to do the exact same things that you have been doing since the Conservative government got elected in 2016. It has been consistent. I do not believe you. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Mahaichuk Marshall. And I'd like to thank you for your presentation, of course, and demonstrating your democratic right here in Manitoba to come forward and do a presentation tonight. I know that, I'll just start off by, again, I've thanked you, but at the same time, you're inaccurate when you talk about the Ontario policy in comparing Bill 33. So I'll leave it at that. I've stated that quite a few times previous to this. And I would just like to say that here in Manitoba, and by the way, that doesn't overly irk me, the comparison between Ottawa and Bill 33. It's just a fact that they're different pieces of legislation. Also, I just did want to quickly mention in regards to the affordability of our tuition here in Manitoba. As you may or may not know, we are the lowest tuition west of Quebec, and actually Ontario's tuition for anyone that possibly wants to go to Ontario to go to post-secondary is actually on average $3,000 cheaper than Ontario's. So with that, I thank you for taking the time tonight, and listening, and later on we'll be seeing an amendment coming forward, and that amendment is coming forward because of the consultations and the meetings that I've had with students. And I'd like to say also that the post-secondary institutions, the relationships between the department and those institutions, I feel are strong, and they're going to continue to be strong because we're a listening government, unlike the previous NDP. And of course, you mentioned debt. I'm not a big fan of the debt either, but at times to make the availability of the money, it just so happens that the Manitoba Student Loans is interest-free. I don't strongly encourage, but if students need to use it, they need to use it, and it's there for the use. To answer my critic's question from the previous speaker, the money in regards to scholarships and bursaries, it is actually a matching, but he knows that because there's been multiple news releases in that, but I just figured I would put that on the record as well. So total of about $30 million in scholarships and bursaries. And so again, Ms. Mahichuk Marshall, I thank you for your presentation.
Ms. Marshall.
Well, I will respond to, you said it doesn't irk you, but it clearly does, again, because you're responding to it, but it is a gross government overreach into post-secondary institutions regarding student fees. Baseline, that is undeniable. That is similar to Doug Ford's student initiative. That is not misinformation. You cannot continue to say that people who criticize this bill for good reason. It's not like we don't know what we're talking about. It's insulting to infer that we don't. Of course we do. We see the similarities, even if you can't. And if you can't, that's a problem. And for your point about that we are the lowest tuition in the West, not for long if your government continues down this road. Finally, your comment, you just had to have a little political jab in there, of course, but that you are a listening government. I will remind you that I brought attention to those consultations because they came after this bill was already tabled. That is not consultation, that is trying to rectify, trying to fix what you had already done wrong. That is not a consultation. People have told you they haven't been consulted, they haven't been listened to, and you don't listen to them when you tell them that they haven't been listened to. And finally, yes, I don't think, I do enjoy your point that you're not 100%, debt isn't your first choice, and that they should use it if they have to. And I will tell you that they do because of your government's actions.
Ms. Marshall, thank you. Mr. Moses, go ahead. And I ask both of you if you could be very brief because the time limit actually has exceeded, but I'm giving you courtesy to the opposition critic and yourself, Ms. Marshall. Go ahead, Mr. Moses.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mahichuk Marshall. I really appreciate your words talking about the impacts that removing the tuition cap had, the fact that in Bill 33, the minister now has no limit on what the tuition increases could be, so we could see that drastically increase given the bill, and speaking so passionately about the government overreach in this bill. And I just want to ask you briefly to talk about knowing what's in this bill and knowing the impact that it could have on the broad scale. I just want to ask you personally, from your experience, what a higher tuition would mean for students in Manitoba.
Ms. Marshall.
Well, I can guarantee that the potential for damage in this bill is exponential. Essentially, he could do whatever he wants. Any minister going forward could do whatever they want. And the people that would be hurt the most are low-income people, people with disabilities, Indigenous people. The potential for harm is exponential. It's hard to even imagine.
Ms. Marshall, thank you for your presentation. This concludes questioning. I will now call on Andrew Cohan, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them to the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
So I'm going to apologize because it's
Mr.
a little
Mohan,
bit,
Mr. Mohan,
loud.
please,
Just a second.
please,
I'll be right with
please
you.
proceed with your. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Mohan, 1 second.
Yeah.
Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Cohan, do you need us to just take a pause and we'll call you back in another presenter or two? What would you prefer?
No, my partner can take him for now. I just wasn't ready at that second. Sorry, but I'm ready now.
Mr. Cohan, please proceed with your presentation.
All right. So I'd like to start by thanking all of you for making this possible for community members to speak, especially during these COVID times with this Zoom platform. I hope that this kind of thing can be perpetuated in the future. I think it makes these kind of things very accessible to many people who couldn't take this kind of time, these many hours over these 2 nights to be with you. I want to speak to Bill 33 from the perspective of a parent. I am here because my child, who you just saw, is 3 months old, and I hope that they still have a university system in Manitoba when they become of age to use it. I think Bill 33 is a dangerous step in making that less likely and making that system a lot weaker to look forward to. So my family moved to Manitoba a couple of years ago, and one of the things that I was most excited about was our low cost of post-secondary education here in Manitoba. I have heard the minister multiple times over the last, this night and the previous night, talk about how we are the lowest cost of tuition in Western Canada, and I think that's laudable. I appreciate that greatly. But the problem with that is that while we're promising that that would remain under your leadership, I don't know that the law guarantees that that would be the case. And I have great concerns about the changes that Bill 33 makes that make that dangerously less likely for my child and for other children in this province. I am concerned that changing the structure of education financing or changing the structure of oversight such that many more things go through the minister's office removes significant independence that the university has to deal with its own affairs. This gives me great pause as someone who received conservative values from my parents and grandparents who talked about the value of looking to institutions that have succeeded and respecting the ways in which they are structured and how they succeed through that structure. I think that Bill 33 dangerously takes power away from those who are closest to the institution, the university, its professors and administrators, and takes some more power and puts it through a centralized government office. I think whatever the intent of the minister today, whether that's around tuition or around the specific programs, making that accessible, making those programs continue to exist, it threatens us when future governments, which may have different priorities, are given those same powers. And so I'm concerned about this approach. And I question whether it is indeed a conservative approach to post-secondary education. And then the other piece, which I think several others have raised over these nights that I'm concerned about as a parent and as a community member, is that if we think about education and the price of education as something that can be offset by bursaries and scholarships, that requires that students have quite a bit of skill or awareness in order to secure those bursaries and scholarships. I've had the great opportunity through my years in Manitoba to work with a variety of community members, both on public engagement around city budgets and other community activities. And there's many great young people that I've run into who are very skilled and I know will contribute quite a bit to our province over the years, but who don't have the wherewithal to navigate these kind of systems, who view a scholarship or a bursary as something not for them because they've never had a positive experience in their education about awards going to them or about people valuing their performance. And I know that they can, if they are given the opportunity to attend post-secondary education, excel. They have the intelligence, they have the skill, they have the drive. But if you don't view this as a place for you, if you're a first generation student, especially the folks I know who are aging out of care and don't have any sort of direct family experience with post-secondary education, I question whether they have the ability to navigate a bursary system or a scholarship system rather than just having a low cost of attendance. And what I would hope would be we could move towards a no-cost model for public education. I think that education in the primary and secondary levels, this is a great gift that we give to our children, and all of society benefits from what we give in this way. But I think that this Bill 33 points towards an approach that views post-secondary education as a plus or as something that you would pay for maybe with debt and then pay off through work. And that's this whole model of valuing different kinds of education in different ways, charging different levels for different kinds of programs. I think it really doesn't respect how post-secondary education is a valuable thing, especially at the university level, where a broad variety of different programs and different kinds of classes that people can take can yield the kind of society that we want to build together. If my father was still alive, he would talk about how important it was to him that he had done his work through his university years to pay off his cost of attendance. And he was working in a grocery store over the summers mostly to do that. I think even though we have one of the lowest costs of attendance in Western Canada, I don't know any young people who are paying off their school fees entirely by summer work. Certainly, if they're working the kind of jobs that most young people I know are able to get, they're not anywhere close to that, especially with the costs of housing if they've moved here from other parts of the province in order to attend a university or college. And I think that we are losing something that we used to guarantee for young people, which is a shot at life. And I worry about the next generation and what we're giving them. So that's why I'm here to speak about Bill 33. I've really valued a lot of the other presenters and their expertise. But as a parent, I would like to share these concerns with you. And I think a number of other parents of young children have also expressed to me their concern about the direction of post-secondary education. And when we hear things like a Tennessee model, I think we ask, has anyone ever looked at Tennessee as a model for public education or for post-secondary education? I don't think it's a place that we want to be modeling ourselves on. I think students there take on quite a bit of debt in order to get those degrees. And if that's what the province sees as the future of higher education here, I think we're headed for disaster. So anyway, those are all my points as a parent. Thank you for listening. And I hope to be able to answer any questions that you have about my viewpoint.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cohen, and congratulations on your entry into parenthood. That look, it's quite exciting, and it's quite a few years ago since I was able to carry my boys around like that. So when you talk about scholarships and bursaries and navigation, absolutely. I know that you as you said, you've come to Manitoba only a couple years ago, but I can tell you from my past experience, the absolute craziness, I do have better words for it, but craziness under the previous government on trying to access those scholarships and bursaries and trying to help and guide students to through that system was a monstrous. You could probably hang a shingle up and create a business on just advocacy on helping those students get to those different scholarships and bursaries. And now what we've done is we've actually taken the scholarships and bursaries and put it in a nice one-stop shop type of thing. And so accessing those scholarships and bursaries and being able to navigate the system has has tremendously improved over the last few years for sure. I agree with you. We need to make sure that our post-secondary education is there for students today, tomorrow, and into the future, and especially for your little one there. And that's what I'm aiming to do, and I'm proud to be part of a government that is also making sure that Manitoba is attractive to other Canadians and people from around the world. So again, that goes with some of the the decreases in some of our taxes that we've been doing as a government in the last 5 years, and I think that's going to make it more attractive for individuals to come, and our ability to train and retain people right here in this great province of ours. So thank you again for your presentation. I've seen some of your work, and you're quite talented. Thanks again.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. I think respectfully, I would respond that a few things, the bursaries being wrapped into an easier package is great, but it is much easier for young students to look at the sticker price of education and see that it's not for them, rather than dig deep and see that there are in fact options available to them. So I would encourage you that those bursaries, while they're great, don't match the kind of accessibility as a lower cost of tuition would. I think also, as for people moving to this province, I didn't look at the tax rate when I moved to Manitoba, which I think a lot of other professionals really aren't looking at that kind of thing. They're looking at whether there are the kinds of services and amenities and solid education systems for their children. And if those things aren't there, there's no way, I would never move to someplace that had a 0% tax rate and no education system. It would be a non-starter. And so I think that if we are looking at tax rate as something that's going to be a draw for Manitobans in various industries, like I've done a lot of work in the tech sector. I know that that kind of work, there's people who are really looking for ways that their children can follow their footsteps in higher education. And also, like, I didn't study tech, I studied political science, but I was able to take other courses through that program and then do work in app development that was possible because I took a broad course of university experiences and could draw on different things other than my tech expertise to build work that was not just tech focused. I think we need this kind of broad educational system. And I worry that the sort of technocratic focus that this Bill 33 and this government is approaching higher education with leaves out some of the kind of squishier parts that make the university system work. And I encourage you to make sure that you're listening to those presenters who have raised those concerns, because those have really resonated for me from that kind of work that I've done.
Mr. Altomar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cohen, for your presentation, especially that parent perspective, one that is quite important for us to get a grip on. And what are your fears as a parent with Bill 33, and what makes you question whether or not this bill reflects what you said is a conservative approach?
Mr. Cohen, if you can answer very briefly, as we are running out of time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think universities as an institution are centuries old, and they reflect a kind of idea about how you build a kind of an intellectual exercise and the search for truth. And I think that these things are to take that kind of institution and to run it through the kind of fine-tooth budgetary comb through a minister's office risks putting some ideas that are hard to figure out how they have direct financial benefit immediately to the province. It risks losing those pieces which make the entire institution work. I think my grandparents talked a lot about how we try to mess with things and try to centralize our control of things at our peril, especially when something is work. When something is working, you don't break it. You don't try to fiddle with things for small momentary gains and lose out on the sort of heritage and long-term contributions that an institution has produced for society. And so that's what I mean when I question whether this is a conservative approach.
Thank you, Mr. Gohan, for your presentation. We will now move on to the next presenter, Joe Curnow, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Curnow, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you to the committee for your time. I know it's late and you've been doing this for 2 days. My name is Dr. Joe Curnow. I am a faculty member at the University of Manitoba. I teach in the Department of Education. And so you've heard so many compelling arguments from so many people who are telling you that this bill is a mistake. And so I'm going to try not to relitigate those because they've been, I think, far more eloquent than I will be. But I want to stress a few things from my expertise and from my perspective. So first, as an educational researcher, I want to say that this bill will not achieve equity outcomes. I teach about equity in schools to teacher candidates in the Faculty of Ed. And what the research shows is very similar to what students have already come before you and said again and again. This bill will not advance equity. We know that for a number of reasons. You've already talked extensively about debt and the way that debt deters students, both because of the very real perceived barriers to accessing bursaries, and the ways that people, for different reasons, will look at the kinds of costs that are associated with this and the rising tuition in Manitoba over the last years, and say, like, this isn't for me, this isn't an investment that I can make. And I think that is a real and serious concern that we need to think about. Who are we serving with this legislation? And I don't think students are it, and certainly not Black and Indigenous students, students of color, disabled students. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to talk about some of that research if you would like. I also want to speak as a faculty member. As a relatively new young faculty member, I have real concerns about the way that this bill threatens university autonomy. University autonomy has for a very long time been a core tenet of higher education, and this really threatens that, making the current government's wills very easy to impress upon the university and to do lasting damage. This bill really threatens the long-term sustainability of the university. I think that this is a bad direction, not only because of the threat to academic freedom, but also because it proposes to replace the expertise of the faculty, the vast research capacity that we have, with an appointed board that serves or has at least the risk of really supporting cronyism at its worst, and doesn't really serve the interests of the university at its best. As Dr. Gabbert attested earlier, there are so many bodies in place, from the Board of Governors to the Senate to others, that take this role really seriously of making decisions about the future programs, making sure that they are the highest quality possible, and making sure that they are running efficiently and effectively. But I also have other questions about how this will impact the university when I think about recruitment. So my faculty and others at U of M have had a hard time recruiting top talent to our university for a lot of reasons, and this is one of them. I think when junior faculty and young professors and graduating grad students look at these kinds of threats, it makes them reconsider applying to universities in our system. People come to U of M despite the support that we have, not because of it, right? So we do not have competitive salaries, we do not have competitive research funding and support. And that makes it really hard for a young faculty person to say, yes, like, I want to go to U of M, I can be successful there for a career, and I can partner with the businesses and the communities in Manitoba to do some innovative research. We really are missing out on a lot of the most innovative researchers because we are not adequately investing in our university. In fact, pulling resources back more and more and asking faculty members to do more with less every year. That also has real financial implications for the university. in that we're less competitive for getting SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR funding. So this tri-council funding is one of the key ways that the federal government gets funding into the province through education. That's how we do training. It's how we fund graduate students. And when I can't get a course release, that means that I can't do that work competitively. That also has repercussions for the kind of innovation that's coming out of our universities. If I want to do good partnership with community members and with industry, it's increasingly difficult for me to do that because there's not adequate support from the provincial government. And that is kind of like a spiraling problem where the less resources put in and the less autonomy the university has to make decisions about where resources go, the harder it is to do this, and then it spirals iteratively. I think this raises real questions for me about the long-term sustainability of the university, because we want to be doing that innovative research. That innovative research is what helps the university to increase its status and its notoriety. It also helps us to make Manitoba competitive economically and socially. It also is just one of these main engines of growth and investment for the province, but it's not treated like that. So finally, I have a lot of concerns about this legislation as a community member. The ministers told Dr. Gabbard earlier that ultimately you are accountable to the taxpayers. And I want to intervene here. I want to say that you are accountable to citizens and to the community. And yes, we also pay taxes, but that is not our primary role. I would like you to think about how investing in higher education and really not trying to exert political control over higher education is a practice of building democracy and making sure that the democracy is healthy and that the university is a key tool and a key partner in making sure that our democracy can function well and that our society can function well, and that is your role, not in only keeping an eye on the pocketbook. And that is a piece of your role, but truly, if all you are interested in is us as taxpayers, then we are really doing something wrong, because higher education has so much to offer in terms of building a robust citizenry where people can care for each other and care about each other and think critically. And many of those programs are not the most viable economically, perhaps, and that does not mean that they are not valuable. One of the earlier speakers spoke about how the requirement to have an Indigenous Studies course was really meaningful to her. And yet it is hard to quantify how that is financially the most viable thing. That doesn't mean that there's not a responsibility for settlers to be engaging in education around treaty and reconciliation and decolonization. And so I think there's so many things about this legislation that really put the health and vibrancy of our democracy at risk. They put the health and vibrancy of our university at risk. And I really encourage you to just withdraw this bill. I don't think it's bringing a lot of value. And I'm happy to speak more about the different research bodies in education that speak to that. But I think that this hasn't been an evidence-informed process so far. And so I hope that you will go back to the drawing board. There's ample evidence from other institutions, from other states in the US who've gone through similar processes and who've had it, who've seen legislation like this have devastating repercussions for their institutions and for their states. And I want us to avoid all of that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Curnow, for your presentation tonight. I, as well as you, I truly believe we both value education, and education is absolutely the key to betterment of individuals, not only here in Manitoba, but across the country and throughout the world. And the goal of Bill 33 is to make sure that the post-secondary institutions and our education here in the province of Manitoba remains affordable and also sustainable. And with that, We need to make sure that we've got top-notch programming, but at the same time, making sure that we strike that balance so that students can access post-secondary education here in Manitoba. So with that, I thank you again for your presentation.
Ms. Curnow.
If the goal is affordability and sustainability, then I think that the better strategy is for us to be looking at universal free education. That is a program and a policy that has much better outcomes in terms of actually making sure that people can access university. It makes sure that people don't have to jump through the hoops of applying to take on debt that they may or may not be able to ever pay off, applying for bursaries, which they may or may not get, and which they often don't know how to get. It has a much better outcome in terms of driving engagement with the university, and driving engagement with the university, not just for credentialing, but for actual learning and engagement and participation in community. And we see in places where there is free education, especially states that have like free education for seniors, you see really robust engagement where people want to take classes and want to participate and want to be bringing what they're learning in the classroom into their workplaces in all of these ways that they wouldn't when they have to pay for it. And so I am interested in strategies that look at how do we make university free? How do we make university courses more available? And that is also a strategy for sustainability, because if you're investing significant resources, which this bill does not do and which this government unfortunately has not done, into university, then I think we see a really different commitment to making the university one of the crown jewels of the province. And I've heard you say again and again that you want to make Manitoba really attractive to people. Having universal education, K-12, that's deeply invested in, as well as post-secondary, is a key strategy for doing that. But there hasn't been moves toward that. All of the moves that we've seen from this government have been to divest from and to exert control over higher education in ways that are really deeply antithetical to that project. And so while I appreciate the lip service, I would like to see actual policy and legislation that reflects those goals of making the university sustainable and making it affordable and making it so that all of our community members can participate and can be part of university education in really meaningful ways.
Mr. Moses.
Thank you, Dr. Curnow, for your very knowledgeable, informative presentation. I thank you for your time and being here this evening. I wanted to ask you two parts that I'm so happy that you actually brought up, which was the equity outcomes and equitable outcomes that will result as a result of Bill 33, and as well as the impact of Bill 33 on research, attracting faculty individuals to do research, and its impact on innovation in our province. I think that aspect is one maybe very serious unintended consequence of Bill 33. So I wanted to get your thoughts on those two issues.
Ms. Curnow, you have just under 1 minute to reply. Thank you.
Okay. So the equity question is, I think, very big. And I think other people have spoken to it pretty significantly in terms of how Indigenous students in particular will be impacted, how folks with disabilities will be impacted. And so I'll let that stand. I want to speak to the attracting faculty and innovation. So we do so much partnership with industry, with community members, with nonprofit organizations, with for-profit organizations at the university. And I feel like a lot of this legislation kind of ignores that. It's like as the government in power, we're going to make decisions about what is valuable. We're not going to look to what the research says or what the expertise of our faculty help us to understand. We're going to decide for them. And that, I think, is going to have really long-term repercussions, because what would get funded in education potentially from a conservative government might not be what the research is telling us in education is going to be the most effective teaching model. And it certainly wouldn't reflect the most innovative things that are coming down the horizon, because those often haven't percolated throughout like public discourse. And so what I might recommend for directions in the Faculty of Education, for example, in terms of how we should be teaching students and how we should be really trying to build for equity in schools, is not necessarily what a particular government in power would think to prioritize
Ms.
in a
Curnow,
curriculum.
thank you for your presentation. The time for questioning is over. I will now call on Norson Harris of the Canada Sierra Friendship Society and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. We will move Norson Harris to the bottom of the list. I will now call upon Elizabeth Shearer, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Ms. Shearer, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, everyone, and thanks to all the members of the committee for being present here for the second evening to hear the community's concerns with Bill 33. So tonight I'm going to cover three main topics: tuition fees, some of the future of workforce development here in Manitoba, and the possible amendment that is coming forward tonight. So right off the top, though, I need to take a minute. So as part of my presentation to address some of the comments made by Minister Owasco on Tuesday night and also tonight towards women and their political affiliations. So I just want to recommend in future committee sessions you actually ask questions during a Q&A portion instead of making statements about a presenter's affiliation. I assure you that if you have a staff person on payroll with access to Google, it's not as impressive as you might think it is. Please refrain from any more condescending remarks that imply women for some reason should be discredited because they're involved politically and as an engaged citizen. Please resist the urge to make these intimidation tactics tonight and throughout the remainder of your time in elected office when you try and discredit any future young women who might one day quite honestly be coming for your job. I remember other women standing up for this type of misogyny, and I empower all women listening and reading on the record to, call this out if you feel safe to do so. So I had to do that off the top, and I will move on. So I'm making my presentation today to the committee with a clear ask. I do want to see Bill 33 withdrawn, and I'm asking for the committee to scrap it. So for all the reasons that people have already brought to the committee, and especially now, as we're still putting ourselves back together as a society a year and a half into a global pandemic. As a graduate student and a staff person working with the student movement in Manitoba, I am alarmed by the process in which students, faculty, and admin seem to only be asked their input on legislation after it's signed, sealed, and delivered to the legislature. This is, of course, why so many of us have come through today, and I really think we can do better. The first subject on tuition that I wanted to talk about is that we know that tuition is the largest barrier to accessing post-secondary education. Why does this government insist on raising tuition each year while claiming some sort of commitment to affordability? Who is saving money in these scenarios you keep pitching, and who is this legislation for? It's clearly not for students, it's clearly not for faculty, and not for admin. So who are you governing for if not for these people? These are the people who actually breathe life and make the important work of universities and colleges work. The minister has said he wants to bring tuition in line with other Western provinces. Does this mean matching Alberta, which on average has 1,000 more, where students pay on average $1,000 more tuition than Manitoba? Or maybe you meant British Columbia or Saskatchewan, which is even higher than that. This commitment to increase tuition paired with the consistent decrease in funding year after year to our universities and colleges in Manitoba leave me with little faith that this government can be trusted to balance both quality of education with affordability for students. And honestly, we shouldn't have to. Bill 33 exhibits a complete overreach of power, and post-secondary institutions should remain autonomous in their decision-making on ancillary fees, plain and simple. Last time I shoulder-checked, the government should not be permitted to use folksy anecdotes instead of explaining its agenda. If you really want to make post-secondary accessible for students, increase grants, bring back the tuition tax credit, restore international student health care. Students are out here making the case for free education, and your government is debating how to market a higher price tag. Next, I want to speak about how the future of workforce development looks to be shaping up with this bill. I'm concerned that market-led priorities proposed by this government will further offload industry's training costs onto students and turn our institutions more into work training centers. And of course, opportunities for employment after university or college is a large reason why students attend post-secondary. Believe me, we know better than anyone because 80% of jobs in this country require some kind of post-sec education. I worry that if we try to set up our post-secondary system to be places to only meet current market needs or to serve business as usual, we'll continue to lose out on, we'll continue to close important doors on so many new innovative ways forward out of the crisis we're currently in and the climate change reality we have been barreling towards for decades. It's also false for the government to claim to know what the future of our education system should look like more than the institutions that run them, as if anyone has access to a crystal ball. Lastly, I do want to talk about student unions and the possible amendment coming forward tonight. Obviously, we haven't seen that piece of legislation. The minister has cited reasons being that it doesn't fall into the process of this committee structure. Obviously, I want you to follow due process within this committee, but I really urge you to actually pitch language towards your constituents and the community that's asking for it in advance of bringing forward legislation. That's largely the reason why we're all here tonight, because this amendment is coming in at the 11th hour. So students are at risk with this piece of legislation. Bill 33, as it's currently written, would obviously allow the minister responsible for post-secondary to determine whether or not democratically elected student fees are compulsory or not. And I know that the minister has said repeatedly that SCI is nothing like Bill 33. I know there were several speakers already today and on Tuesday that really explained how similar they are. And honestly, I mean no disrespect, but I think you need to refer back to your notes on SCI, and I challenge whoever is providing you with your notes to give you a refresh into what the Student Choice Initiative actually was. The language, the definitions that it has added, you really must refer to the piece of policy that was put forward by the Ford government to make those kind of statements again. So if you want to undermine the autonomy of student unions, I don't think you can anymore, because you are committing to passing an amendment that we have yet to see. But I would want to echo the definition put forward by the Canadian Federation of Students, which defines student fee. So student fee means a fee set by a board that's payable by a student to a university or college, but does not include any fee set by a student union pursuant to any student union legislation, including the UMSU Act. So I really urge you to be using language that explicitly protects student unions and student union legislation in your amendment. On that note, the minister, you have claimed that you are simply amending to add clarity to the bill, implying that that how it's written currently wouldn't allow you to determine student fees. But I really call this into question. Clearly, you're trying to pass an amendment to strengthen this bill, and students have come together united to speak this truth to you, and you were forced to walk back your agenda of defunding their student unions. And I'll also offer a bit of a reflection here that we've seen the PC caucus and its staff have engaged with students' concerns on Bill 33 publicly in a really problematic way. So on social media and in talking with the press, even in this committee, students have been called pawns, accused of spreading misinformation, gaslit when our concerns were noted, and then pandered to only if we spoke in a way deemed appropriate by the minister and his office. This has inhibited some pretty intense tone policing towards students, and I have to say it's been pretty horrible to see this behavior exhibited by an office of the legislature. I will close on some of my statements tonight by asking if the Honourable Minister Owasco would like to apologize for their comments made towards students in his attempt to discredit them. Certainly now that an amendment's on the table, you'd want to apologize for attempting to silence student voices that brought these important issues to the fore. Because which is it? Are students spreading misinformation, or did you try to pass this broken piece of legislation? It would seem the latter because you're making an amendment, and I don't think you can have it both ways. So I really welcome this apology to occur in our Q&A or after my presentation or, on Twitter, whatever you want to do. But in closing, I do urge you to scrap Bill 33 and go back to the drawing board. I've seen this government try to pit students against students, student unions against each other, unions against faculty, faculty against admin. And I just want to extend just such a wide net to all of those actors that are listening here or reading, that our solidarity and our work together is so crucial in challenging this agenda, and looking forward to it. So host proper consultation with students, with faculty, and with admin, and honestly with families. They're going to be the ones burdened with your decision for years to come.
Thank you for your presentation. Your allotted time for 10 minutes is over. Do members of the committee have questions for the presenter? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Scheer, for bringing forward your presentation. Just for the record and for clarity, it was actually the leader of the official opposition of the NDP that brought up your name and the fact that you ran as an NDP candidate for Winnipeg South Centre. As far as, and I applaud you for that. And I applaud all women for choosing to put their name on a ballot. I have many former students and friends who are women who are either elected officials or working in high-profile occupations. And so, unfortunately, Ms. Scheer, I absolutely take offense to some of your assertions tonight. But that being said, I thanked your organization for the congratulatory letter when I was first appointed. In that letter, asked for a meeting with myself, and so I forwarded that meeting, and then throughout that meeting, it was clear to me, even though I had said that within the bill does not affect student fees brought forward by student unions or associations. Your organization wanted to see some clarity, so I actually offered up a technical briefing with nonpartisan departmental staff. You accepted to that, and you came into my office actually and had that technical briefing with nonpartisan departmental staff, which they made very clear to you and your organization that the bill had no effect on student unions or association student fees. Of course, voted on through your own democratic process. And then shortly thereafter, we received a note from the Manitoba Alliance for Post-Secondary Students asking for an amendment to make it even more clear. So then we actually wrote to both the MAPS organization and CFS Manitoba organization and said that we are going to consider an amendment to bring more clarity to that part of the bill. So we've done that, and later tonight, that's what we're going to be passing. I did receive from your organization sometime this past Friday of your intent many weeks after the one came from MAPS in regards to the amendment, but I thank you for that correspondence, and shortly we'll be going through and hopefully passing an amendment to the bill to bring further clarity, and that comes from multiple times of meeting with your organization and other organizations, including other meetings that your organization has had with my predecessors as well. So thanks again, Ms. Scheer, and I all the best to you in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Ms. Scheer.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think any of that was a question or an apology, but I will clarify some of the points that I think were made to try and discredit me further. You brought up the affiliation for multiple presenters over the course of Tuesday evening and this evening who were signed up as private citizens to speak from that perspective. I myself am included under that designation, and you still refer to me as an organization that has already presented on the behalf of students, over 40,000 students that it represents. So I don't really think that you have a case like to discredit me here. And I'm really grateful that this is on the record, because I do encourage you to go and review that, your comments, and learn about not making those types of mistakes in the future. So I don't really have a lot more for you than that. And as regards to my professional work with the Canadian Federation of Students, really proud of the work that we do to unite so many students, and was really proud of the showing of so many of them to raise this issue with you on Bill 33 and how problematic it was. And do really appreciate that they are exercising their full democratic practice here by presenting to this committee.
Mr. Moses.
Ms. Scheer, thank you for your presentation. I just want to begin by saying that I think it's unfortunate what you've experienced and what you've outlined here. I want all people and all Manitobans, particularly women who are underrepresented in politics, to feel welcome and invited to engage with their politicians during this process. So I apologize that you feel this way, and other presenters during this session of 2 days have felt that way. It's very unfortunate, and I hope that all MLAs can be held to a higher standard in that regard, as you have quite rightly mentioned. And I do want to ask you, though, about your thoughts on, since they're not addressed in this bill this year, what are some things that students would actually like, the students that you speak with, would actually like to see to make their educational experiences better?
Ms. Scheer, the time for answering the questions is actually over, but I'm going to give you some time, very briefly. Thank you.
I mean, this multi-evening format, I think, in response to this bill demonstrates that students have a lot to say and want to help shape the future of post-secondary in our province. So any way that we can increase participation and consultation to the full definition of what consultation means would be a great place to start, and refer back to anywhere that we get lost in this process, because we're all going to make mistakes, and I'm not the type of person to do some finger wagging, and neither are students. Students are keen on finding solutions, and I think they're the right group to do it. So I would encourage that perspective to be consulted more thoroughly and in advance of creating legislation that directly affects them.
Thank you for your presentation. And the time for questioning is over. We will now move on to Zach Fleischer, private citizen, and ask the moderator to invite them into the meeting. Please unmute yourself and turn your video on.